Okay, stop scrolling. I need 20 minutes. Not a fashion video. Not a 10 ancient outfits listicle. This is the real story. Here's the question nobody asks. Why do you own clothes? Not why do you own that hoodie? Why does the concept of clothing exist at all? You probably think you know the answer. Modesty, shame, covering up what shouldn't be seen. You're wrong. Completely wrong. And the real answer is stranger, colder, and way more brutal than anything Sunday school taught you. Tonight we go back, way back, before writing, before farm, before cities, before almost everything you'd call civilization. We're talking about the moment a naked, furless ape decided to start wearing other animals' skin. And once you understand why, you'll never look at your closet the same way again. Buckle up. This gets weird fast. Let's kill the myth first because it's everywhere. Adam and Eve, fig leaves, sudden shame, hiding from God. That story is old, but it is not that old. Compared to the actual timeline we're about to walk through, that story is basically yesterday's news. Humans didn't invent clothing because they suddenly felt embarrassed. For most of human history, across most of the world, nakedness wasn't shameful at all. It was just Tuesday. So if it wasn't shame, what was it? Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Scientists actually figured out roughly when humans started wearing clothes. And they didn't do it by finding ancient shirts. Fabric rots, hide decomposes. Nothing survives that long. They did it by studying lice. Yes, lice. Stay with me here. There are two main kinds of human lice. Head lice, which live in your hair, and body lice, which live in clothing, not skin. Body lice can only survive if clothing exists. No clothes, no habitat, no body lice. So geneticists studied when body lice evolved as a separate species from head lice, because that split can only happen once humans start wearing something regularly enough for a new parasite to specialize in it. The answer? Somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Let that number sit for a second. That's not ancient Egypt ancient. That's not beginning of agriculture ancient. That is deep, deep prehistory. Before humans even left Africa in large numbers, which means clothing is older than language as we know it, older than art, older than most things we consider human. Okay, so now the real question. Why then? Why did our ancestors, who had survived just fine without clothes for hundreds of thousands of years before that, suddenly need them? Two words: Ice Age. Around that same window, the planet was going through brutal climate swings. Cold snaps, glacial periods. Africa itself got colder and drier in place. Picture this. You're a hairless primate. Evolution stripped most of your body fur away millions of years earlier because it helped you sweat and hunt in heat. Great trade for the savannah. Terrible trade the moment temperatures crash. You can't grow your fur back. Evolution doesn't work on a deadline, so you improvise. You take fur from something that still has it. That's it. That's the whole invention. Genius, right? Almost insultingly simple. Kill an animal or scavenge, strip its hide, wrap it around your own freezing furless body. Suddenly you've outsourced insulation from your own biology to somebody else. You basically became history's first fashion thief, and the victim was a woolly rhino. But here's the twist that makes this bigger than just cold, so wear skin. Clothing didn't just keep humans alive, it let them go places biology said they shouldn't. Without fur, without clothes, humans are a tropical species. Full stop. We belong in warm climates. That's our factory setting. But somewhere around 100,000 years ago, humans started pushing north, into colder Europe, into the freezing steppes of Asia, into places that should have killed them within a single winter. They survived because they'd hacked their own biology using someone else's skin. Think about that. Clothing is arguably the first piece of technology that let humans override their own body. Before tools that extended their reach, before weapons that extended their strength, clothing extended their entire habitable range across the planet. You are literally descended from people who figured out, without any science, without any biology textbook, that dead animal plus live human equals survival. That's not prim. That's one of the sharpest ideas anyone has ever had. Now here's where it gets even crazier, and this is the part most people never hear about. We actually have physical proof of how they did it, not just theory, actual tools. In a cave in Siberia called Denisova Cave, archaeologists found something extraordinary. A bone needle, carved, polished, with a tiny hole through one end for thread. That needle is roughly 50,000 years old. 50,000 years. Before pyramids. Before the wheel. Before written language of any kind. Somebody sat down, took an animal bone, and painstakingly carved a sewing needle. Why does a needle matter so much? Because a needle means something huge. It means humans weren't just draping animal skins over themselves like a blanket anymore. They were tailoring, fitting garments to the body, sewing pieces together for a tighter, warmer fit. A draped hide keeps you less cold. A sewn, fitted garment can be the difference between life and death in serious cold. Better insulation, fewer gaps, sleeves, actual hoods. This is the moment clothing stops being a blanket and starts being an outfit. And here's a detail that should genuinely genuinely blow your mind. Scientists believe this leap in sewing technology is one of the reasons modern humans thrived in freezing environments, while another group of humans, right around the same time in the same place, did not. I'm talking about Neanderthal. Neanderthals lived in Europe through brutal ice ages for over 100,000 years. Tough, resilient, physically built for cold with stocky frames and big chest cavity. But here's the thing. Archaeological evidence suggests Neanderthals mostly used simple draped hide, not fitted, sewn clothing like modern humans eventually developed. Some researchers think this gap, better tailored clothing versus simpler wraps, may have given modern humans a real survival edge as the climate kept swinging wildly. Let that sink in for a second. A needle, a tiny sliver of carved bone, possibly playing a role in which type of human species made it into the modern era and which one didn't. You ever feel like your problems are small? Imagine your entire species' survival partially hinging on whether somebody figured out how to poke a hole through a piece of bone correctly. No pressure, prehistoric humans, and here's a follow-up question worth sitting with. If clothing genuinely gave modern humans an edge over Neanderthals, that means an article of clothing may have quietly shaped which human lineage exists today and which one vanished. Not a war, not a weapon, a coat. Let's talk about a much more famous piece of evidence, because this one you might actually recognize. Urtzi the Iceman. In 1991, hikers in the Alps, right on the border of Austria and Italy, stumbled onto a frozen body sticking out of melting glacier ice. At first, everyone assumed it was a modern hiker who'd died in an accident. It was not modern. Urtzi turned out to be roughly 5,300 years old, perfectly preserved by ice the entire time. And here's why he matters so much for our story. Urtzi wasn't just a body. He was wearing an entire outfit, frozen and intact, a coat stitched together from different pieces of animal hide, sheep, and goat mostly, sewn with surprising skill. Leggings made from goat leather, shoes with a genuinely clever design, bearskin soles for durability, deer hide panels for the upper part, and a woven inner layer stuffed with grass for insulation. He even had a bearskin hat and a woven grass cloak worn over everything like an early rain jacket. Scientists studying Urtzi's gear were stunned by how sophisticated it was. This wasn't some crude survival wrap, this was engineered clothing. Different materials chosen deliberately for different jobs, waterproofing, insulation, durability, comfort, all figured out through pure trial and error, thousands of years before anyone had a word for gear. Modern outdoor brands genuinely study Urtzi's shoe design today. Let that sink in. A 5,000-year-old hiking boot is still teaching modern engineers something. Now, let's talk about what these early clothes actually looked like more broadly, because it's not what pop culture shows you. Forget the cartoon caveman in one shoulder strap fur outfit. Early clothing was layered, functional, built by people who understood their environment intimately because their lives depended on it. Animal hides were the backbone. Deer, bison, mammoth, reindeer, depending on region and what was available. Hides were scraped clean of fat and flesh, sometimes soaked, sometimes smoked, to keep them from rotting and to make them softer and more flexible. That process alone, scraping a hide properly so it doesn't stiffen into cardboard, is a skill, a real, teachable, generational skill. Get it wrong, and your winter coat turns into a rigid board the first time it gets wet. Sinew, the tough fibrous tissue from animal tendons, became early thread, incredibly strong. Basically, nature's dental floss, repurposed to hold civilization's first outfits together. Bone and antler became needles, awls, and toggle. Plant fibers, where available, got twisted into cordage for tying garments shut. And in warmer regions, clothing looked completely different. Lighter wraps, woven grasses, bark cloth beaten thin and soft. Because remember, this wasn't one invention happening once. This was hundreds of separate human groups across different climates, independently solving the same basic problem with whatever materials their environment handed them. Cold tundra groups built layered, sewn, fur-lined garments that functioned almost like Arctic gear. Warmer regions built breathable wraps designed to protect from sun and thorns rather than frostbite. In parts of ancient Australia, Aboriginal communities developed cloaks from possum skin, sewn together and often decorated with carved designs on the inside, worn fur side in during cold nights and used as blankets when not worn. Some of these cloaks doubled as a kind of family record, with patterns added over a person's lifetime. Same species, wildly different wardrobe, all of it built entirely through trial, error, and passed down knowledge, with zero written instruction. Now here's a pattern interrupt for you, because I promised this would get weirder, and it does. was. Clothing wasn't only about survival. Almost immediately, it became about something else too: identity. Around roughly 100,000 years ago, maybe even earlier, we start finding tiny perforated shells at archaeological sites in places like Morocco and Israel. Shells with holes deliberately punched through them, worn as beads. These aren't random. They show wear patterns consistent with being strung and rubbed against skin or clothing, exactly like a necklace or a decorated garment edge would create. This means that almost as soon as clothing existed as a survival tool, humans were already decorating, personalizing, turning a purely functional item into a form of self-expression. Think about how fast that happened. Barely any time at all, evolutionarily speaking, between "I need this to not die of hypothermia" and "but also, can it look good?" Some things about humans really never change, and this decoration wasn't just vanity either. Researchers believe body ornamentation like this likely carried social meaning, group identity, status, maybe even something like early fashion trends, signaling which community you belonged to, just by glancing at someone's beads or the cut of their hide garment. Imagine being able to tell someone's entire tribe, their skills, maybe even their rank, just from their outfit. Sound familiar? It should. That's still basically how fashion works today. You just traded mammoth hide for streetwear logos. Now let's talk about who was actually making all of it, because this part of history has a massive, frustrating gap, and it's worth naming directly. Across an enormous number of documented traditional societies, historically and anthropologically, textile production, sewing, weaving, hide preparation was overwhelmingly women's work. Not universally, not everywhere, every time, but overwhelmingly common enough that anthropologists consider it one of the most consistent patterns across unrelated cultures worldwide. Which means, statistically, some of the earliest tailors in human history, the people who figured out fitted clothing, who invented and refined sewing techniques, who kept entire communities alive through brutal winters using nothing but bone needles and animal sinew, were very likely women. And yet, when you picture ancient survival, what image pops into your head? Probably a guy with a spear hunting a mammoth. Meanwhile, somebody back at camp was solving the actual engineering problem of how an entire group of humans survives a Siberian winter without modern insulation. That's not a footnote. That's core infrastructure. We build monuments to hunters. We rarely build monuments to the people who figured out thermal clothing technology 50,000 years before anyone had a word for thermal anything. Funny how that works. There's also a quiet economic detail hiding in here that most people never think about. Preparing hides, spinning thread, weaving cloth, these are enormously time-consuming tasks. Some estimates suggest that in early farming societies, producing enough thread for a single garment could take dozens, sometimes hundreds of hours of spinning, which means clothing wasn't just a technology. It was one of the very first major time investments in human history. Entire day, weeks, sometimes months of labor poured into something you'd eventually wear out and have to remake. That's worth remembering the next time you complain about doing laundry. Now, let's fast forward a bit, because clothing kept evolving, and the story doesn't stop at survival gear. As humans settled into more permanent communities, started farming, started building the earliest cities, clothing started doing new jobs. It wasn't just about surviving the environment anymore, it became about surviving each other, socially speaking. Clothing started marking wealth, rank, occupation, marital status, religious role. In ancient Egypt, fine white linen marked the elite, while laborers wore simpler, rougher versions of the same basic garment. In parts of ancient Mesopotamia, specific textile patterns and dyes were restricted to priests and royalty. Purple dye, extracted painstakingly from thousands of crushed sea snails in the ancient Mediterranean, became so expensive and labor-intensive that entire empires eventually made it illegal for regular citizens to wear one color, reserved by law, purely as a status symbol. Imagine getting arrested for wearing the wrong shade of purple. And yet, that's genuinely how seriously ancient societies took the social power of clothing. Dye itself is a whole hidden story. Long before synthetic colors existed, communities figured out how to pull vivid, lasting color out of plants, insects, minerals, and shellfish. Red from crushed insects, blue from fermented plant leaves, yellow from certain roots and flowers. Every single one of these processes was discovered by someone, somewhere, through pure experimentation, probably after a lot of ruined batches of cloth. This is the moment clothing splits into two permanent, tangled purposes: function and status, survival and signal. And honestly, we never fully separated those two threads again. Pun completely intended. Now here's where the modesty story finally enters, and this is important because it comes in much later than most people assume. As organized religions developed, many of them built entire moral frameworks around covering the body. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and various other traditions all developed specific teachings around modest dress at different points in different regions for different theological reasons. But here's the key detail that gets lost. These moral and religious frameworks around clothing and modesty emerged tens of thousands of years after clothing itself already existed as a practical survival technology. In other words, humans didn't invent clothes because they felt ashamed of naked. Humans invented shame around naked in many later cultures, partly because clothing already existed as the cultural norm. Once everyone around you is wearing something, going without suddenly stands out. And once something stands out, cultures start building rules and meanings around it. Shame wasn't the seed. Shame was practically an afterthought, grafted on tens of thousands of years after the original invention, in specific cultures for specific reasons that had way more to do with social control, religious identity, and property structures than with any innate universal human instinct. Different societies, even fairly recently in historical terms, had wildly different relationships with nakedness and modesty completely independent of any of this. Which tells you something important. There is no single universal human instinct toward covering the body out of shame. There is only culture layered on top of a much older, much simpler original invention. An invention that started with one very basic problem. It's freezing, and I don't have fur any. Let's also talk briefly about footwear, because it barely gets mentioned and it genuinely should. Some researchers who study changes in ancient foot bones believe humans may have started wearing some form of footwear as early as 40,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The evidence comes from subtle shifts in toe bone strength between older and more recent skeletons, changes consistent with feet that were regularly supported by something rather than walking completely bare. Footwear meant humans could cross terrain that would otherwise shred bare feet. Sharp rock, frozen ground, thorny brush. Another small, quiet technology that expanded exactly where humans could go and what they could do once they got there. One more stop before we zoom out, because this one changes everything. The loom. For tens of thousands of years, clothing meant hide, fur, and whatever you could wrap or stitch together. Then, somewhere between 8 and 10,000 years ago, in multiple regions independently, humans figured out something new. Weaving. Taking thin plant or animal fibers and interlacing them into flat, flexible sheets of fabric. This is genuinely one of the most underrated inventions in human history. Weaving meant you weren't limited to the size and shape of whatever animal you'd killed. You could produce fabric in any size, any shape, any quantity, as long as you had fiber and time. Flax became linen in Egypt and the Near East. Wool became cloth across Europe and Central Asia. Cotton got spun and woven across South Asia and later the Americas. Silk emerged in ancient China, guarded as a closely held secret for centuries, so valuable that entire trade routes eventually formed just to move it across continents. Each of these fibers required its own painstaking process. Flax has to be soaked, sometimes for weeks, in a process called retting, just to loosen the fibers enough to be spun. Wool has to be sheared, cleaned, carded, and spun. Silk has to be unwound delicately from the cocoons of silkworms, thread by impossibly thin thread. None of this was simple. None of this was obvious. Every single step was worked out by someone, through repeated failure, long before anyone wrote down a single instruction. And once weaving existed, clothing changed shape entirely. Fitted garments became more common. Patterns became possible. Fabric could be dyed before or after weaving, layered, embroidered, traded internationally as a genuine luxury good. Whole economies eventually formed around textile production. In some ancient societies, cloth itself functioned as currency, traded and valued the same way we'd use money today. Imagine paying your taxes in linen instead of dollars. So let's zoom all the way back out. You wake up in the morning, you open a closet full of shirts, jackets, shoes. You don't think twice about it. It's automatic, mundane, barely a conscious decision. But that closet is the end point of an unbroken chain stretching back somewhere between 80 and 170,000 years. A chain that starts with a freezing, furless human standing over a dead animal, realizing that its skin could become their skin, at least temporarily. It continues through carved bone needles in Siberian caves, through scraped hides and twisted sinew thread, through tiny shell beads worn as some of humanity's first jewelry, through a frozen iceman in the Alps wearing a genuinely engineered outfit, through the first creaking wooden looms turning flax and wool into flat, wearable fabric, through purple dye laws and linen hierarchies and moral codes written millennia after the technology itself already existed. Think about everyone who touched that chain pain and never got a name in a history book. The person who first noticed a hide could be softened by chewing or scraping. The person who first twisted plant fiber into cord strong enough to hold a garment shut. The person who first threaded sinew through a hole in a sliver of bone and realized two pieces of hide could be joined into one. None of them knew they were building a technology that would eventually clothe every human being on Earth. They were just trying to survive one more winter. Every hoodie, every winter coat, every pair of jeans in your closet is a direct descendant of that first improvised animal, wrapped around cold skin in an ice age you can barely even imagine. Clothing isn't really about modesty. It never really was, not at its core. It's about adaptation, about a fragile, furless species figuring out how to survive in places its own body was never built. And somewhere along that incredibly long road, it also became about identity, status, art, and belonging, which honestly makes it one of the most quietly impressive inventions in human history. Not flashy like fire, not dramatic like the wheel, but arguably just as essential to how far humans eventually spread across this planet. So next time somebody makes an offhand joke about fashion being shallow or clothes being just clothes, remind them. What they're wearing is the great-great-great-grandchild of a technology that let an animal with zero natural cold protection walk out of Africa and eventually settle literally every climate on Earth from deserts to the Arctic Circle. That jacket hanging in your closet isn't just fabric. It's roughly 100,000 years of trial, error, freezing nights, careful hands, bone needles, and quiet genius, all compressed into something you put on without even thinking about it most mornings. Ancient women, and ancient humans generally, didn't start wearing clothes because they were ashamed of their bodies. They started wearing clothes because they refused to let a little thing like not having fur anymore stop them from surviving literally anywhere on the planet. And honestly, that's a far better story than any fig leaf.